This is a tricky subject that we're talking about today. It's a subject that I've wanted to talk about for a long time, and I'm very happy to have Robert talking about it. Robert, Scarlett, and I are volunteer historians here at the museum, and this is part of a series that we're giving about trying to develop a story for the neighborhoods of Summerville. Last time we met, Robert spent a fair amount of time talking about the origins of neighborhoods such as Buttonsville over beyond Sumter Avenue and Pigeon Bay, I'm sorry, and the Quarters. All these are places in Summerville that have a story that has to do with how population groups worked in Summerville through the development of after the Civil War. The start of all this was basically the pre-Civil War society that was here was a very obviously segregated society, and yet they lived together. That the enslaved people lived on the same land as the white masters did. And the Civil War, of course, changed the entire association of people and how they understood each other. And yet they were still living in the same places where they were living during the war. And so it ended up with the properties around here having a very mixed neighborhood, as we would say today, as opposed to segregated neighborhoods. And so, and you still find this is true over in the historic district around Sumter Avenue. You'll find white and black houses, owners for years living in the same place. And this is the story of how it's happened that way. After the war, there was Robert spoke of this last time, there was a sense of wanting to make it better in here, and it was not as tense as it was in some other places about the racial integration that was required in society, because there was no longer such a stark difference in status between black and white people by law. And many of the black people who lived here were literally at the level of socializing, were very familiar in the families. They were not called slaves generally, and when you read about them, the white people referred to them as servants. And they were distinguished from the people that are classically thought of as slaves in the Low Country, which is primarily what would be called in those days field hands. The people that worked the rice fields and the other agricultural works of the plantations. The house servants were far more familiar with the people who lived in the houses, and they lived right beside the houses. And you can still see this arrangement all over Summerville. If you go in the backyards of some of the larger antebellum homes, you'll see the slave quarters in the back. My neighbor, I live over on Richardson Avenue. My neighbor, 2 doors down, has slave quarters in his backyard. And he said that he remembers as a child a woman whose name was Miss Annie, who lived in there. Her story is that he knew as a child was that she had been there since the 1880s, living in that house. Where she came from, what her story was prior to that, he didn't know, but he knew that Miss Annie, as an elderly woman, lived in the quarters back there behind his house. And it was just simply where she lived. I don't know if there's any rent arrangement or anything else. I really don't know that part of it. So, what Robert's going to talk about now is another part of this story, which is there was the integration by marriage and by other unions, I guess, of the white population with what would be called the colored population. The word colored is a general term that means not white. And when you get into the Jim Crow stuff, the standard for Jim Crow very quickly became one drop, is what they called it, is one drop. If there was any kind of suggestion that you had something other than only white genetic material in you, that you were not considered white. And to not be white was all they went with. They didn't talk about what you were if you weren't white. They just said you're not white. If there was some kind of evidence that you had some kind of interracial component in your genetics, then the classification in society would be you're not white. And if you were not white, you were colored. Now, colored meant anything besides white. That's what it would meant. And so in the colored group then we had obviously people of African American descent, many people of African American descent. But we also had around here American Indians, and the Native Americans were quite obviously here, and it was similar to other places like around New Orleans where the Creole people, a lot of the Creole population of New Orleans has an American Indian part to their heritage. And this happens in eastern North Carolina, the Lumbee of eastern North Carolina, around Lumberton and places like that, are similar to what happened here in Summerville. The people of the tribal people saw themselves as not of African American descent. They thought of themselves as, this is where we live, this is where we've always lived, we're tribal people. The white people saw them as not white, and that was the end of it. And so this yeah.
We called them brass ankles.
That's what we called them, and we'll be talking about that today. And this is now the situation at the end of the Civil War that Robert's going to be talking about, and I'll conclude by talking about Cook's Crossroads, which is a really interesting, specific example of what we're talking about. Robert.
All right, thank you, Dr. West. As you said, Dr. West will be back with this in a little bit after I finish running my mouth for a while. As you said, we're really continuing on from what we started talking about last week. So I'm going to start by really giving you a summary, because some folks were not here. Not last week, last month. Some weren't here. So this is part 2 of this particular lecture, so let me get rolling. So to be accurate, today's discussion really, it stretches the boundaries on what we typically consider Summerville. You know, what is Summerville properly? So we're going to push beyond Dorchester Road, Orangeburg Road, but it's really important to understand the people of these areas and all of the areas surrounding Summerville to get a clear picture of what was going on here early on and how it developed. So once again, the main information that we're going to talk about today came from the same sources I used last time. 91-year-old gentleman by the name of Sinclair Mack. He is my main oracle to sit and listen to great stories from him. Another older gentleman by the name of Wendell Nolan, who's a local in this area, grew up in this area, and of course, Dr. West is always my number one source for all things Summerville. So let's begin by providing a basic summary of Part 1's lecture as a way of tying all of this together. We begin at the true beginning of Summerville by identifying the original boundaries of what became known as the village of Summerville, which we affectionately call Old Summerville today, comparing it to today's community or New Summerville. I begin by sharing this early map from the 1830s. Probably the most surprising part when you look at Summerville in the 1830s is how small it actually was compared to today. Central Avenue, which you see right here, if you're familiar with Central Avenue, think about it this way, the railroad tracks are way over here. So Central Avenue really became sort of a boundary. St. Paul's Church was considered the end of Summerville. So what does that really mean? That means that Hutchinson Square and Azalea Park were not part of Summerville during this time. As a matter of fact, those areas were underwater. So what you see right outside here years ago was swampland. It was all underwater, right? So we shared the railroad company eventually owned those portions that they could, that we think of as swampland and other areas during that time. And when we started building the impressive canal and drainage systems that keep Summerville dry now, that's when we were able to combine those two areas. Once that was drained out properly, that's when we were able to combine those areas. So 1800s in this area gave us the first opportunity to really discuss reasons for the diversity of many of Summerville's communities, starting with those enslaved Africans who as early as 1825 were allowed to establish separate dwellings on the lands of their owners here in Summerville. And after the Civil War, as Dr. West was mentioning, many of those owners who considered them servants more so than slaves felt an obligation to continue taking care of them by allowing them to remain on that land and establishing free dwellings on that land. Also, we discussed a lot of the African Americans in Summerville that ended up here came here because they were part of the 35th United States Colored Troops. Yes, we had a unit of colored troops stationed in Summerville as part of the Union Army during the Civil War. A lot of people are surprised by that fact, and we'll talk a little bit more about those groups as we get into education. A big part of this talk today is going to be focused on education that was made available to minority groups in these areas. This is the fun part for me last week. Starting to talk about historic black neighborhoods in Summerville. Where were they, right? So it's surprising to me, a very misinformed northerner, as I often confess to in here, to discover there was no evidence of overt redlining or well-defined lines forcing racial segregation in Summerville, unlike the rest of South Carolina. Instead, the African Americans who grew up here expressed pride when they got a chance to talk about their historic parts of Summerville where they grew up. They didn't have any bitter taste from growing up here. They enjoyed the life that they had here, and they like to brag about that life. Summerville contained a mixture of officially and unofficially named communities. Dr. West talked on some of them earlier. The main ones we talked about, the Tracks, also known as Up the Tracks, the Quarters, the Bay, Red Hill, Buttonsville, Brownsville, and Germantown. All those were communities, some on a map, some not. Many of these were names that they just came up with, up the tracks, because they lived up the tracks. Right? Real simple. A lot of these names were real simple. Right? But I like that. But one of the last things we discussed were the black entertainment and socializing venues in Summerville at that time. They included the Duck Inn, I kind of like that name, it's kind of cool. KP Hall, the 5220 Club, one of my favorites because it was named by the owner because he bought the club with his last check when he got out of the military, and that check was for $52.20. So that's a cool name for the club, right? Appropriate. And the last was the Many Faces Club. So we closed with a historically significant relationship that was true in Summerville during that time, and it continues to be true today. And that is the beautiful relationship between the Jewish American community and the African American community in Summerville. We talked last month about how one of our favorites here at the museum, Saul Alexander, whose man cave is out here in our garden. If you wonder what that structure is out in the garden, that came from Saul Alexander's house. That was his man cave. Nice poker table and all that kind of stuff inside. But he was also one of those early businessmen that hired a lot of black labor from the neighborhood. Gave kids a chance to get a job and earn some money. So that relationship was very important. So I want to begin part 2 of this conversation, the way I ended the last one, is talking about educational opportunities. That's my favorite thing. Okay? My focus is always on any group that struggle to gain educational opportunities. For those that don't know, I'm a high school teacher. He knows because I'm his teacher. He's here for extra credit.
And the thirst for knowledge.
The thirst for
Yes.
knowledge, okay. Well, this is actually one student I can say that's true with.
Okay.
Not all of my students is that true, but for Cam, yeah, that's actually true. So let's talk about one of the first early examples of educational opportunities. So all of these you see on the screen represent opportunities for education within Somerville for minority communities during that time. So we began with the Dorchester Free School and Board, the first school board in our area. It was established at Colonial Dorchester. Anybody ever been to Colonial Dorchester? Right there off Dorchester Road?
I got married.
Oh, hey, that's a story I want to hear. I bet that was cool. Well, they did it to provide education for that budding town. Funding was on a voluntary generosity basis. Can you imagine if we funded our school now and who wants to pay their taxes? Right, we'd really be in trouble. It opened in 1758 at Dorchester, but was burned by the British in 1781. It was rebuilt in 1797 and was relocated to Summerville in 1818. The free school stood on Central Avenue at the site of the old Manigault property on the northwest corner of Central and Dorchester. So if anybody knows where that is. The school was active until the Civil War. Funding after the Civil War was not reestablished for the school board, but the board continued to operate without getting state or federal funding. 1906, they opened an elementary school on Laurel Street with private and town funds until it became part of the public school system in 1912. In the 1950s, it was demolished and replaced by Saul Alexander Park. But the Dorchester Free School Board has continued since that time. It is the oldest continuously operating school board in all of America. Today, the work consists of fundraising for college scholarships for local students. Next was the group I talked about, the 35th United States Colored Troops. The I here, this group is the 35th United States Colored Infantry. That's what the I is for in that case. They started out as the 1st North Carolina Colored Volunteers in New Bern, North Carolina. Colonel James Chaplain Beecher, brother of abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe, was chosen to command this new unit of African American troops. Then the name was changed to the 35th United States Colored Troops and was reassigned to Folly Island, South Carolina. Unit was made up mainly of former slaves and free blacks of all ages. They saw action in Florida, but saw more action here in South Carolina, fighting in Honey Hill and DeVoe Neck, South Carolina in 1864. Eventually, the 35th ended up here in Summerville, camping basically where Rollins School of the Arts is located today. In an article published in an 1898 magazine that's held here in our Dr. Ed West Research Library upstairs, Colonel Beecher's wife, Frances Beecher Perkins, discussed her efforts to educate the troops under her husband's command. Her efforts did not stop after the unit was disbanded in Summerville. After the Union Army took command of Charleston, public schools were established, and Frances Beecher Perkins became principal pro temp of one of the schools. And according to her, the school had 30 teachers and 600 students. And my favorite part is she mentioned they had 1 floor of white students and 3 floors of black students. That thirst for knowledge was incredible during that time. After the Civil War, we really begin to see the importance of the right to vote and how that can impact educational opportunities. Sadly, we also saw the #1 reason why white Southerners fought so hard to keep the right to vote out of the hands of African Americans. You see, in South Carolina, the 1860 census showed that African Americans made up 57% of South Carolina's population. During the era of Reconstruction, which is basically 1865 to 1877, the population was allowed to vote, and vote they did. So much so that they made up the majority of the elected officials in the South Carolina State House, even achieving the office of lieutenant governor twice with Alonzo J. Rainzer in 1870, followed by Richard Howe in 1872. This African-American dominated state house passed the 1868 state constitution that for the very first time mandated free public education for all children in South Carolina. Although it was never funded, local private schools and some public schools began to appear. Another opportunity, 1888, Dr. Charles Shepard founded the Pinehurst Tea Plantation, one of our favorite places to talk about here in Summerville. Not only was tea grown, but many other rare and exotic trees, plants, and shrubs, making this among the most outstanding gardens in the country. Instead of exploiting African Americans after Reconstruction ended, Dr. Shepherd made a deal with African American families. If you would allow your young children, with their little hands, to come pick tea at the garden, he would pay them based on the weight that they picked, but more importantly, he promised them a free education. Very important during that time. When the children were not harvesting tea leaves, they were in the school that Dr. Shepherd provided, honoring the pledge he made to parents. Dr. Shepherd paid the salaries for the teachers and the assistants. In addition, he paid for the building and bought the textbooks. You see there the students outside of their schoolhouse on the tea plantation. Even Theodore Roosevelt, President Theodore Roosevelt came out and visited, and the kids sang to Theodore Roosevelt. We have pictures of that as well, which is really, really cool. I don't like what the picture says, the caption on the bottom. The caption on the bottom says, "Pickaninnies singing for President Roosevelt." Yes. So that part's ugly, but the school, that was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful. Pinehurst Tea Picker School was already in operation about 5 to 8 years before the St. Barnabas Mission was established, which became another source of education opportunities for indigent Black, white, and American Indian children. The next previously discussed source of early education in Summerville I want to touch on is called the Bank School. Catherine Kitty Springs, one of the heroes of this museum. If you go upstairs, we have a nice display about her as well. She was critical in this endeavor. She was an astute businesswoman and property owner. Her husband was a merchant in Hutchinson Square, and she too had a store right out here in Hutchinson Square and a very nice dress shop down on King Street in Charleston. No one knows exactly what her ethnicity is. She's known as African, Cherokee, white. She was a very, very mixed race woman, right? But it's beautiful that she was able to be so successful in Summerville during that time. Kitty Springs funded what became known as the Bank School for Negro Children in Summerville. It gained its name because the school was held in an old bank building. One of our other Summerville heroes, which we have a big display of upstairs, Mr. Rollins Edwards, was a student at the bank school. So it's nice to have those firsthand experiences. This
Where
leads.
was the bank school located, do you know?
Doc was out there. It's right. We know where the Timride Library is.
Oh, yes.
Across the street from the behind the Timride Library is where we. Go ahead.
The original school is still there, where you're speaking of. If that's what's that third? Is it the one in front of Bethany Church? Is that second or third?
Yes.
Second south. Almost directly across the street from the chapel of Bethany. The house there in the backyard is said to have incorporated the bank school into the structure in the back of the house. I can't see it. I've been back there looking at it. I don't see the bank school in this context of the structure, but I can believe it's there because we've seen this in other places. The original bank school was situated on the corner of Pine Street and First South, I guess, and Pine Street, which is where the Lutheran chapel is. The St. Luke's Lutheran Chapel is on the back side of the main sanctuary, on that corner on Pine Street. That's where the bank school was when it was originally located.
We'd love to get into that structure today, but it's somebody's house. So kind of hard. When I went back there, you go as far as you comfortably can, but you don't start creeping around the backyard of somebody's house.
No, that's true.
Yeah. You don't want to get shot or something when they think you're breaking in. Yeah, not these days. You want to be real careful. But that does lead us to the so-called Red School, also made possible by Kitty Springs and the St. Barnabas Mission. That's more in line with what you were just talking about a little earlier. Like I said, I love talking about any group trying to progress through education, right? So in 1883, Reverend LeGrand F. Gurry was the pastor of St. Paul's Church. He decided to grow the church by reaching out to people in more of the rural areas. This included a group of people that he referred to as the Summerville Indians. First service was held in this local home, believed to have been held in this local home, which is very important, where they were located. The so-called Summerville Indians were reclusive and lived on the margins of settled areas. As the congregation grew, the church built a small building on a vacant lot to operate from. In addition to church services, they used the building as a school. The chance at freedom through education caused many local Indians and poor whites to flock to the school. Soon that building was also too small. Known as the Red School of St. Barnabas Mission, it primarily served two isolated tribal groups of children, often referred to as the Somerville Indians. One group, the Wassamasaw Indian tribe, who today live in the Varnertown area around Highway 17A and Carnes Crossroads, and many live in Cross, South Carolina. The other main group, the Edisto or Natchez Cuso, lived near Ridgeville. Kitty Springs had been involved with the St. Barnabas Mission for many years. It is believed her multicultural identity influenced her desire to help the local American Indians and the poor of all ethnic groups in the area. It was her generosity that supported the St. Barnabas Mission's Red School for poor white and American Indian children. The mission was a day school that also served as a public health center and mission church. The Red School operated from 1883 until the 1930s and 40s, when its students were forced to integrate into the regular public school system. Dr. West, did you want to add anything on the Red School?
It's likely that the name of the school came from the fact that they were associating with American Indians. That's likely where the name came from, although I don't know that. The children who went to the school had to really walk a long way. If you think about how far Ridgeville is outside of Somerville, and how far Carnes Crossroads is from Somerville, that's a long walk. Those kids did that every day. It's just hard to think about it. The site of the St. Barnabas Mission today is where the county building is at North Main Street in 78. That's where the St. Barnabas Mission was. The infirmary was originally, I think, simply serving the indigent out there, and then it became a segregated operation that eventually became Dorchester Hospital, County Hospital. And that's why that was set up on that. This is basically when the St. Barnabas Mission kind of came to a conclusion when the Dorchester County Hospital went out.
So before I introduce that new educational opportunity that I'm excited to talk about today that I learned recently, I want to introduce something recently learned about as far as Cook's Crossroads. Now, Dr. West is going to do the heavy lifting on Cook's Crossroads, but I want to tell it from a different perspective, with a focus on a portion of that area before it turned into Cook's Crossroads. I'll briefly discuss the indigenous history of this area and the former Shoes Plantation, pronounced Shoots by the locals. Shoots Plantation was located on the land currently occupied by the Ponds housing development. Anybody know where the Ponds are? Very historic area. In fact, the Ponds includes the restored 19th century farmhouse that was built on the property, on the Shoes property in the 1830s. It is currently used as the main community center. In addition, the original plantation site also includes over 1,000 acres of preserved land known as the Conservancy, which maintains the natural environment and historical archaeological sites on that land. I also discovered that the name the Ponds, when I saw them name it the Ponds, I thought, well, that's cute. That's something new. But it's not new at all. That name has a very long and significant history dating back to a plantation called Weston Hall. This site was important during the Yamasee War. The local Goose Creek militia was called up at Fort Ponds. This provides me an opportunity to talk a little about the indigenous population. Please come on in. The indigenous population who lived and hunted in these areas. One such group was the Etowah people, who originally lived closer to present-day Charleston Bay and Cooper River area. Following the Yamasee War, some Etowah were granted a permanent reserve in the nearby Wassamassaw swamp area. In addition, the Edisto-Cuso, or Cusabo, were low-country tribes who occupied land along the Ashley and Edisto rivers. The area today is within the recognized historical territory of the Wassamassaw tribe of Varnertown Indians. This state-recognized tribe is a community of descendants from various low-country groups, including the Etowah, Edisto, Catawba, and Cherokee, who settled together in the Varnertown settlement near Karns Crossroads, which is the general vicinity of Summerville and Monk's Corner. The community also has been historically known as the Summerville Indians. Before European settlement, the area around Cook's Crossroads was part of the territory of tribes like the Edisto and Cuso. Today, the area is historically and culturally linked to the Wassamassaw tribe of Varnertown Indians. The family image you see on the screen in the center here was part of a Farm Security Administration project. Photographer Marion Post Wolcott took pictures of the Clark family in Varnertown in 1938. She listed the home as near Summerville. It is actually 10 miles east of Highway 17A between Karns Crossroads and Monk's Corner. Photographer with this photograph, which was captioned Indian Family Near Summerville, includes Mrs. Geneva Varn Clark and 3 of her sons, Melvin Hamp Jr. and Joe, Melvin Hamp Jr. and Joe. Her 4th son, Robbie, 4 years old, was in the house with their father, Hampton Hamp Clark Sr., who refused to be photographed. Over the years, the Clark family and their descendants grew to 57 family members by 1997. Some of their other surnames are part of the 8 names associated with being Varnertown Indians today. These families are spread between 2 major areas today there. According to Reverend Arthur Clark, former chief of the tribe today is known as the Wassamassaw Indian tribe of Varnertown and Cross, South Carolina. It's a long name. The land itself, as I said earlier, was granted to a man by the name of Andrew Percival. His plantation's early focus was on rice cultivation. In 1723, the Percivals sold the land to William Dunning, who along with his son used enslaved Africans to cultivate crops and raise cattle. Percival was the first name that we see on record as getting that land directly from the King of England many years ago, in 1634, I believe it was. So we know about the slavery on the Dunning plantation because on July 12, 1735, the South Carolina Gazette announced that a major auction of 125 slaves and all the oxen, sheep, horses, plates, and household goods and plantation tools belonging to the estate of William Dunning and Thomas Dunning, Esquire, deceased, were to be sold at the Ponds Plantation in Berkeley County near Dorchester. At one point in 1769, William Henry Drayton owned the northeast tract of the Ponds and used it to raise horses. I find that interesting. Drayton sold his portion to Colonel John Glaze, who already owned the other portion in 1794. The Glaze family eventually sold the land to John Christopher Gottfried Scholes. Yes?
Was that in Berkeley County?
It was in Berkeley County,
At
yes,
that
sir.
time? I would have thought it would have been in Colleton County.
Nope, it's listed as Berkeley County during that time.
They were very casual about that.
Yeah.
There's no telling.
See, Mr. Scholes was a German Protestant who him and his family came to America to join other German Protestants that had come to South Carolina. He also bought a home in Summerville, familiar story, to escape the malarial swamps during the summer, which, as we know, is where we get the name Summerville from. people buying summer homes to get away from the swamps, from their Ashley River plantations. John Scholes died of a heart attack in 1833. His widow maintained most of the property until she died, and her son Frederick maintained the property. Image you see here is of Captain Frederick C. Scholes with his military unit, Company F, 3rd Battalion, South Carolina Light Infantry, or Light Artillery, known as the Chestnut Light Artillery. They were encamped with mixed race elements. The Shoes family owned the land from 1818 until 1865, before selling it to the Lotz family, one of the heroes of our story today. In 1911, the Lotz family sold it to the Simmons family, who used the land as an active farm, growing corn, cotton, sweet potatoes, and raising cattle. In the later part of the 20th century, the property became more focused on recreation. It was leased for hunting and fishing, and that historic farmhouse was used as a hunting lodge. By 2005, the Simmons family sold the remaining 1,984 acres, which was known as the Ponds Plantation, to the Greenwood Communities and Resorts, later taken over by Coulter Homes, and developed into the current master plan community that we have today. So that is the generic history of a place. But I love firsthand accounts to really discover what a place was like. Again, Mr. Sinclair Mack provided that for me. One story he told me about was yet another example of the peaceful relationship between white and black citizens of Summerville during the Jim Crow era. This story came forth when I asked him what he and other black kids did for fun in Summerville during that horrible era of Jim Crow segregation. His response reminded me of his quote from part 1 of the lecture when he said, "Summerville was very prejudiced, but I don't think they knew what it meant, because it was just a word to them, because a lot of things went on between black and white." You see that a lot when you talk about Summerville. Summerville was not like Lowndes County, Alabama, a lot of those places where you really didn't want to be black during that time. Summerville just seemed to be something different about Summerville and how they treated each other. Here in his response to my inquiry about what they did for fun, he said they would walk up to Five Forks and hitchhike a ride to Bacon's Bridge. They would try to get there before noon when it was high tide and jump off the bridge into the water. At Bacon's Bridge, there used to be a man-made beach with sand and an old country bar. He said there was beautiful swimming in the Ashley. There was no diving board, so they had to dive off the bridge. Now here is where the segregation imposed at the bridge was clearly ridiculous. He told me the black and white kids had to dive off different sides of the bridge. The white kids dove off on the side where the bar was. If the white kids dove on their side while the tide was coming in, it would push them to the black side and vice versa. But there was never any problem. If the white kids dove on their side while the tide was coming in, it would push them to the black side. And when they came up out of the water, says they would socialize with the black kids for a while and then go back to their side. When the black kids would end up on the white side, they would go into the store, buy some Coca-Cola and some salted peanuts, and cross back over to their side. Not much real segregation there. I love it.
Robert, for a visual, probably none of them had bathing suits on.
I'll try to get that out of my head. Well, thanks, Doc. But when Mr. Mack began talking about his life on Shoes Plantation, his passion led me to ask myself a question. Can a place have a heartbeat? Can a place have a soul? Can a place store up memories waiting for a single person to return and claim them? For Bozel Mack, that place was Schutz's plantation. But when I asked him to describe the importance of Schutz's plantation in his life, the laughter stopped. And the heartfelt reminiscing began. He said, Schutz's plantation is me. More precisely, that place for him was Schutz's Lake. For Bozo Mack, Schutz's Lake represented his heaven on earth, his Walden Pond, for those that understand that reference. If you don't, read. It was the great author and poet Henry David Thoreau who wrote an entire book just to express the immense joy one can experience when they embrace a simple life, with nothing between them and what God has created. For Summerville Sinclair Mack, Schutz's Lake and that farmhouse are all that remain of the land on which this 91-year-old man, whenever he comes to town, instantly transforms into an 8-year-old boy, once again living the best that life could possibly offer. Although our talk was over the telephone and separated by over 600 miles, he's in Delaware today, I could sense the sparkle in his eyes and feel the joy in his spirit as he shared what that plot of land and that body of water means to him. It is fitting that a place that serves as his Walden Pond now exists within the boundaries of a Summerville, South Carolina housing development called The Ponds. Mr. Mack went on to say, when speaking about the importance of Schutz's Lake, I had everything that I needed and wanted. I never felt like I suffered for anything. For a young black child in the 40s and 50s, that's saying something. Now, although this is one man's opinion, I feel compelled to share more of his heartfelt words about his love for this land. I ask you to bear with me a little longer, and I pray you have or will find this feeling at some point in your life. He went on to say, after referring to the song Sweet Caroline, you might know the song Sweet Caroline? Sweet Caroline. There we go. There we go. And he said, I was wondering if they knew what made Carolina sweet. What made that dirt road I walked on sweet. To feel the sand between my toes with no shoes on was fantastic to me. To sit down on the back porch in the afternoon and listen to your grandfather and hood knights talk about the day's work while they eat a freshly cut watermelon or cantaloupe. And later on, you hear a whippoorwill in the distance calling its mate. Or at night when you go to bed, you can hear the crickets. This is life. This is live. I don't think I ever wanted too much other than that, and Schutz's Lake had all of that. You could feel, and he said a whole lot more. I didn't try so much with it as I listed, but I just wanted to try to capture what that place really meant to him. One of the lessons he learned during his time at Schutz's plantation came from a poor white man. Mr. Mack said every shingle on Schutz's plantation was crafted by hand by Walter Clark. He said Mr. Clark predicted that one day Schutz's plantation would no longer be a Walden Pond-like environment, but a modern area with paved roads and lights. He told Mr. Mack not to worry about that and left him with this quote: "It's not important where you are, it's where you're going." This comforted Bozo Mack as he was about to leave his beloved Schutz's plantation to attend school in New England. From this majestic, and some might call it mythical place, this young Negro boy from Summerville, South Carolina, began his quest and love for knowledge and appreciation for sports in a little 3-room schoolhouse built with love and determination to ensure the next generation had a better chance than the generation before them. Okay, now I can tell you the story of the newest educational opportunity for African Americans in Summerville that I recently learned about. An opportunity made possible by a team of African American Christian men and a generous German immigrant. It started with Camel Hill United Methodist Church and led to a 3-room schoolhouse and cafeteria. According to Mr. Sinclair Mack, Camel Hill Church hosted the first black school in the Knightsville area for students who lived too far from Austin School. He said black kids could only go to school 2 or 3 days a week because they had to work in the fields. But the people in the community knew they needed a full-time school. They turned to local community leaders who were affiliated with Camel Hill Church. They formed a committee to make it happen. This committee included Odie Singleton, Jimmy Edwards, Calvin Patrick, and Chris Flood. These men went to a white man named Martin Lotz. According to Mr. Mack, if you had anything you wanted done, you went to Martin Lotz. Martin Lotz, whose father once owned Schu's Plantation and ran a small sawmill in Cotton Gin, offered to build a school and a lunchroom for free, but they had to provide the labor. That school continued the educational opportunity first provided by Camel Hill United Methodist Church. But in many cases, students had to walk anywhere from 3 to 5 miles one way to get to school. Mr. Mack at the time lived on Schu's Plantation, as I said, pronounced Schutz by the locals. These were German Americans. Therefore, the proper pronunciation of their name is closer to Schulz in German. It's actually spelled S-H-U-L-T-Z. So when I first saw it, I thought, Schultz, no problem. But no, you gotta do it in their language. Schulz, in their language. So unlike other black children, Sinclair Mack was driven to school from Schu's Plantation. Hood's Knight, the white caretaker of Schu's Plantation, used to take him to school in the morning after dropping his own children off at the bus pickup point. There was no bus for black kids. So he drove them all the way to that 3-room schoolhouse that was built just off Orangeburg Road. Other black children were not as fortunate. Many of them had to walk anywhere from 3 to 5 miles to school as they watched school buses full of white students pass them by. For them, that was a small price to pay to get the education they so desperately wanted and needed. As a teacher myself, I would love to see that level of passion in today's students, or at least in their parents. Oof, I'll stop right there. One thing that has not changed is the connection between one's level of education and their level of economic success. Now, building a 3-room schoolhouse and a lunchroom, that was one thing. Staffing them was another. According to Mr. Mack, the principal of Austin School, who he named Mr. Fields, but my research suggests a different name. It indicated that the principal of Austin School from 1946 until school integration in 1970 was Fred S. Cox. Any of you have a history of that? Been here long enough to know? Just curious. I always like the first-hand knowledge. But that's his understanding of that school. Either way, he says the principal got the state of South Carolina to promise that if he could find teachers for the school, they would pay the teacher's salary. So he got a lady named Eliza Wins, who taught Mr. Mack in the 1st grade in that 3-room schoolhouse. There was also C.S. MacGyver. He taught Mr. Mack all he knows about sports. Miss Reeds from Simmons Quarters taught piano lessons for 10 cents a lesson. And last, the wife of Rollin Lemon taught at that school. Those were the 4 teachers at that 3-room schoolhouse. They were there early enough in the morning to build a fire for the kids. Students had to rent the books, so you might have 3 or 4 students reading out of one book. Mr. Mack described the location of the 3-room schoolhouse as follows. He said, come down Highway 17A from Summerville. When you get to Boone Hill Church, there'll be a fork in the road. Isn't that old folks' directions? Mm-hmm. There's going to be a fork in the road. Take the road to the right, which is Tupper Lane. He said it was called Tupper Lane because that is who lived back there. The Tuppers, the Lemons, and the Robinsons. He added that the first Boy Scout troop was put together by Rollin Lemons when he returned home from Korea. He then said Tupper Lane will bring you to Orangeburg Road, take a right on Orangeburg Road, and go about 2 blocks and the site will be on your left. Today, the area where the schoolhouse would be, is located behind Blessed Visions Ministries, just off Orangeburg Road. To get there from Summerville, you would take Highway 17A or Boone Hill Road to what today is Tupper Way Drive, turning right onto Orangeburg Road till you come to this church. This cemetery right behind you, when I knew I was in the right place, this cemetery is called Camel Hill Cemetery. I'm like, okay, got the right spot, since the church name has changed over the years. But it also has a bench that says Campbell Hill Church. So I had to talk to him about that story. He said, well, the folks at what's the name of the church? I don't know the name of this church. I did forget. Anyway, they were all at one church, and they got into an argument, and the Campbells split off. And they ended up starting their own church. So that's how, early on it was Campbell Hill Church, they broke up, and it became Campbell Hill Church. So you go in that cemetery, you see both. It's Campbell Hill Cemetery with Campbell Hill bench there. And right behind there, which you can't see anything because there's nothing back there, that's where the school was. I just took these pictures like 2 weeks ago. Back there is where the schoolhouse was. On this empty spot of land, you see this little dot here. That's a building, a metal building right there for a company that's back there. And Mr. Mack says where that building is where the, would have been behind that building to get to the lunchroom, and he said the playground. But he said, well, let me be clear. When I say the playground, it was an open field. There was nothing back there. That's just where we played. So we called it the playground. So hey, make do what you got. But it's interesting to be back in that area even today. Okay, this takes us to our final discussion point, connected directly to Schu's Plantation, in the area today known as the Ponds. The story of Cook's Crossroads and the incredible, if somewhat sad story of the Cook family, from which Mr. Sinclair Mack claims to be a descendant. By loose definition, the specific area known as Cook's Crossroads includes the intersection of Dorchester Road and Bacon's Ridge Road, down to South Carolina Highway 61 and Ashley River Road in Dorchester County. Mr. Mack shared with me a way to tell the two groups apart, and Dr. West will talk about the issue between the white side and the black side, which I found fascinating. But Mr. Mack said, all right, this is how you tell the two sides of the family. He said if the name is spelled Cook, C-O-O-K, they were the black side. But if it's spelled Cook, C-O-O-K-E, it was a side passing for white. Nevertheless, the group that was passing still faced some limitations in white society.
You told us about this, right?
Yes, I did. He listened. Okay. So I now turn it over to Dr. West, who tells that story far better than I ever could.
I said I had backwards.
Can I just ask you, I'm confused about the ponds.
Uh-huh.
Are we really talking about the ponds, which is out there by Summers Corner?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
That's exactly what we're talking about.
Thank you.
Robert and I have different references on the way the Cook spell their names,
Well, you and Mr. Mack have different references.
and that's fine with me, I don't know. It's a little disturbing, however, because it apparently is how they distinguish between the white cooks and the non-white cooks, is whether there was an E on the end of their name, and I imagine it mattered to them whether they go this way or that way, but I don't really know. The Cook stuff is really, really interesting, and we really can't understand it very well because there's so many layers of genealogy involved in it, and the records are so variable. You know, when you go into census records, every 10 years the U.S. Census is taken. In the South, census takers were just people that wanted a job. You know, that they didn't know anything about taking a census. That what's the work here? I'll go do it. And they trained them in this area. I know they trained them around here this way, and probably this generally was to assess who you're talking to and assign a race to them. So, some guy you don't know, and it's probably a 25-year-old guy that doesn't have anything else to do with his life, walks into your home and writes down on the census what your race is. I don't think you probably know what he wrote down, by the way. He's just talking to you, but he's writing notes and he's taking notes, and then he goes away. And sure enough, in the National Archives now, 100 years later, there's your family, and that's what it says about your family, is whatever he wrote down in his little note. And there isn't any other authority about it. It's just what he wrote. And so this is what people like Robert and I have to deal with when we're trying to find out, well, exactly what's going on here. Is we're basing it on information that was recorded at the time by people in this category of skills and of social judgment, I guess, of trying to figure out what's going on here with who I'm talking to. So you end up at Cook's Crossroads with people called in one decade mulatto, which means mixed racial, and another decade they're called white. Same person. And some other parties are called colored, and some other parties called black or Negro. The same person. And it just has to do with who's looking at you. And so this shows up in trying to figure out the things we're talking about today is very complicated. And so I don't want to be dogmatic about anything I'm saying. I'm giving you kind of a summary, and there's really no point in going into details about the genealogy stuff. Cook's Crossroads basically is the area where Rose Park is right now. Rose Park is at the intersection of Highway 165 and Highway 61. Highway 61 is the Ashley River Road, the Plantation Road. Highway 165 is the Delamar Highway. The Delamar Highway crosses Highway 61 across the Ashley River, continuing north across Bacon's Bridge, and now you're on Bacon's Bridge Road. So the Bacon's Bridge Road then is an extension of Highway 165 into Summerville.
So you're talking about an area right around the corner from the new library, kind of.
That's where Bacon's Bridge is, but Delamar, the Cook's Crossroads is beyond that.
The
South.
intersection.
It's south of that,
Right.
yes. Okay, so you're on Highway 61 is the Plantation Highway. That's probably the oldest authorized road in South Carolina. It was authorized by the Colonial Assembly in 1691. And the plantation owners, which at that point would have been the very earliest ones, and the Middletons were part of that, were mandated by the Assembly to use their enslaved people to build as a highway, because it was the highway of the Lord Ashley barony. This is where Lord Ashley Cooper's barony was. He had 12,000 acres south of the Ashley River in that area. So Cook's Crossroads began as the Lord Ashley's barony, and Highway 61 was the connection to Charleston. The Delamar Highway is almost as old as Highway 61. It was the connection between basically Rantol's, Stono, coming up through the Caw Swamp, which is the great big wetlands through all that area there, where Ashley Ridge High School is now. Going past Ashley Ridge High School north to Highway 61, crossing Highway 61 to Bacon's Bridge and Dorchester Road, becoming Bacon's Bridge Road at that point. Everybody follow where I am? Mm-hmm. Okay. Rosebrook Park is right there at the crossroads of 61 and 165. To the eastern side of that, which is the Charleston side on Highway 61, if you think about what you do there, there's the two highways are this way, but there's also a cut through that area. Mm-hmm. The cut, you take your chances with the cut. Sometimes you eat the bear, and sometimes the bear eats you, and you take the cut. The cut forms a triangle. The cut wasn't always there, probably. I think likely a lot of the connections there are more modern. I really don't know how the original connections worked. But I can tell you that right east of the triangle, there's a house. Right there, as you're going from Highway 165, going on Highway 61 toward Charleston, you're going across by the triangle. You go past where the triangle enters Highway 61 going toward Charleston, and right beyond that is a house. It's on the northern side of Highway 61. That house contains the schoolhouse that was called the Cook Schoolhouse. This house itself incorporates the Cook Schoolhouse in the house. I've seen it.
Now,
You
did
can
they always have a verse from the Bible?
Yeah, that's the place. So the people who live there are still cooks in terms of their heritage. There's still lots of cooks out there. This land was traditionally handed down generations through cook lineage. The original cook was Layler Cook. It probably wasn't his name. He was a German. Most likely his name was Koch, K-O-C-H, and it's anglicized to cook. So he didn't have an E on the end of his name because he didn't know what an E was. He's German. So Layler Cook, or Koch, maybe have been his name, I don't know, married Hagar Simmons. Hagar Simmons came off the limestone plantation of that area. The limestone plantation was huge. And if you go to Dorchester Road and Bacon's Bridge Road, I think that's called the Limestone Crossroads or something, I think it is. But anyway, there's a sign there, I remember seeing a sign there. Limestone plantation is everything south of that area, basically. Toward the Ashley River and across the Ashley River was limestone plantation. So the limestones were there. Limestone's very early English development. The limestone that matters in the story was Thomas Limestone, who was a Confederate captain. And he apparently and Hagar were friendly. I don't know what their relationship was. Hagar was enslaved on the limestone plantation. This is a picture of Hagar as an older person. This is her as an older person. Hagar was enslaved as a young woman on the limestone plantation. And was the product of Thomas Limestone's friendliness with Hagar's mother, as far as I can tell. No one cleared this with me, and no one gave me any other information. I'm doing the best I can right now. But it looks to me like Hagar's mother was, the father of Hagar was Thomas Limestone, a white man. The story is that Hagar was Cherokee, which means her mother was Cherokee. Now, you hear this a lot when you're doing mixed racial stuff like we're talking about right now, is that they're Cherokee. They don't call them Indians, and they don't call them the name of the Indians in this area, which was Kosovo. They don't call them that. They call them Cherokee, as though almost Cherokee is a generic term in this area. Because really was not much Cherokee stuff around here. The Cherokee were mostly north of here, toward North Carolina and western South Carolina is where the Cherokee were. There were Cherokee here, by the way, but there just weren't many of them. As Kitty Springs is said to be Cherokee, in the same way that Hagar is said to be Cherokee, and I believe likely it was more of a generic term for American Indian. This is the way that the term was used, but I don't know that. So Hagar shows up marrying Layler Cook in the 1880s. And they had this property out there at Cook's Crossroads. And it was corn and cattle, soybeans, stuff like that they were growing there. Layler was a hunter, and he was famous for being out in the woods doing what hunters do. Hagar was having kids, and boy, she had them. There were lots of kids, so Layler was doing other things besides hunting sometimes. And so, as the kids showed up and the generations, they were given lots of land out there. Now the kids are showing up in all different shades. By 1900, there were all kinds of different colors of cooks out there. Some of them were clearly white people, and some of them were clearly black people, and some of them, I don't know what they are.
Do you think they may have been homesteaders?
What do you mean?
In other words, they didn't buy the property, but
Well,
they just settled on it?
I would guess the term would be sharecroppers, but I really don't know. I don't know that. I do know that that it looks to me like the Cooks owned the property. I don't know how it started, but it looks to me like the Cooks owned the property. Can't imagine them having a lot of money, but they own the property, because they still own the property. There's a Cook cemetery, a substantial Cook cemetery out there, just past the Delmar Highway on Highway 61. And they're buried out there. The Cooks are just out there. There are several other family names associated with Cooks that worked into this group. And I've interviewed enough people to kind of get a feeling of what was going on out there, of people that have a heritage from that place. It's just fascinating to listen to it. I have a lot to say that would be, details of things that may or may not be interesting, but the one story I wanted to tell you was my interview with the person who gave me this picture. Was named John. No, I haven't said his name in a while. I know. John Rett, yeah. John Rett was 101 when I knew him. John Rett said his father was best friends with Layla Cook. He was a light-skinned person. He was not white, but he was very light-skinned, and he considered himself a black man in Summerville. His niece, I believe, was named Betty Rett. She was a very wonderful person. I had a really nice conversation with Betty Rett for a long time. She and I used to go to meetings together sometimes. Betty was a nurse. Betty was light-skinned, and she'd just sort of become John's caregiver. And so that's how I met her, along with the meetings, because I met her in the meetings and found out about John, and she brought me home to John, and I got to know John, and we just talked. But Betty was in the middle of all this stuff. Betty grew up at Cook's Crossroads, and she was a cook. And she told me that she went to the Salter School out there. Now, I'm not sure if this is the Salter School or not. Robert had this as maybe this is the Red School. We really don't know what the school is, but clearly it's labeled as a school for I forget what it says, Negro or colored or something, non-white children at Summerville. That's what the label on this picture says. The picture's in the Library of Congress archives. And these were taken by this lady that came through here named Marion Post Walcott, taking pictures for the government through the South of just what the South was like. And that's what she found here. If you imagine going to school at this place, I mean, Robert, you're a school teacher. That's where you live for 6 hours every day. I can't tell if it has any windows at all. I don't know if it does or not. There might be a window or two on the side of it, I don't know. But you can imagine the amount of light in that place, and you can imagine how, just what it would be like to be in that little place as a child. Betty remembered going to this school, the Salter School. If you go out Bacon's Bridge Road, you know where the Church of Latter-day Saints churches on Bacon's Bridge Road, just before you get to Dorchester Road. Across the street from that is a place called Ridge Drive or Ridge Road or something other. It's basically a road that goes perpendicular to Bacon's Bridge Road to the left as you're going toward Bacon's Bridge from Summerville. You go down that road, you get on Salter's Lane. And when you get back Salter's Lane, it looks like this. It still looks like this. And you can just kind of see a little nothing schoolhouse sitting back there. I don't know, but I imagine it when I go back there. I can see it. That looks like where it could be. Betty remembers going to Salter School, going past, from where she lived at the Cook's Crossroads, going past the Cook School, which I told you was at the crossroads itself. This is at least another mile or two beyond that, going towards Summerville and going off into the right into the woods over there. She remembers doing that on cold days, her brother carrying her. She was 5 years old, she said. And she remembers that. That's not that long ago. That's probably the 1950s. And she remembers doing that. Her brother carrying her. The children at the Cook School were white children, apparently, but they were called brass ankles in Summerville, because people knew who the Cooks were. If you were a Cook, you weren't one of us if you were white. That's just the way it worked. I don't care what color you are, you ain't right if you're a Cook. You ain't right. And that was the way the children dealt with each other. The Cook children grew up together, played with each other as neighbors and friends would play, until 10 or 12 years old, and their parents told them they couldn't play with the little white kids anymore, or they couldn't play with the little non-white kids anymore. And that was the end of being cousins.
And you know, it was tragic, and I think back now, when I was in high school, and the prejudice that I bought into.
You didn't even know you were doing it.
I didn't, and I am so horrified today. So many, and my.
Okay, so anybody in this room that remembers any of this stuff, it was just a kid. What does a kid know? That's just the way it is. A kid knows what a kid knows, which is nothing. I mean, people who lived here all their lives don't know what I just now said. What would they know back in those days? This is all pretty new stuff that Robert and I are digging up about what happened out there. But anyway, so this is just the way it was. Just the way it was. And what was remarkable, though, is the theme that Robert keeps picking up. And yet, it worked. It somehow worked. Everybody understood how it worked, and everything worked somehow. It worked, and they got over it. It was okay to be this way. The one story I want to end with is, in this room, I was at a meeting between Betty Rhett and her white cousin from Florida. They had never met each other. They'd never met each other. She contacted the museum and said she was a cook from Cook's Crossroads and wanted to know if I knew anything about Cook's Crossroads. So one thing led to another. Betty Rhett says, that's my cousin. And I was here when the two of them sat here and hugged each other. So that's my story.